At my sister's wedding in Charleston, South Carolina, on a suffocating June afternoon, the air was thick with heat and thicker still with tension. The white facade of Trinity United Methodist glowed against the sun, and guests in pastel dresses and crisp suits drifted toward the heavy wooden doors, laughing lightly as though the world belonged only to them. I had chosen my dress carefully, a simple navy blue meant to disappear into the background, but I never expected that my very presence would be denied at the threshold. A hand came up in front of me, the usher's voice stiff and rehearsed. "I am sorry, ma'am. You are not on the list." Behind him, the organ hummed its first notes, summoning the chosen into the sanctuary while I stood outside like an intruder at my own sister's celebration. Before I could respond, my mother's voice sliced through the air, low but sharp enough to draw blood. "She does not even belong here." Her eyes never met mine. They slid away as if I were a shadow clinging to the edges of her perfect day. My father, Richard Mitchell, broad-shouldered and still carrying the authority of a retired Navy officer, narrowed his gaze at me. His jaw tightened, his lips pulled into a thin line of contempt, and he gave a curt nod to the usher. "Do not let her in." He said it not as a request, but as a command, a barked order from a man who had spent his life expecting obedience. I felt the weight of eyes on me, cousins, whispering neighbors, exchanging looks, the low ripple of amusement passing through the small crowd at the door. And then came the laugh, a short, victorious sound from my cousin Thomas, who stepped closer just to twist the knife. "Not on the list, Clara. Guess that tells you everything." His smirk spread wide as though he had just won a prize. For a moment, I could not breathe. The air pressed down against my chest, my hands curled tight around the clutch in my fingers, and every humiliation I had endured in this family seemed to rise up at once. Ghosts of years when I was overlooked, silenced, dismissed. The words my mother had spoken were not new, but the cruelty of hearing them aloud in front of strangers in front of the church steps was almost unbearable. I wanted to speak, to insist, to push past the guard at the door, but my father's glare froze me where I stood. It was the look of a man daring me to challenge him, daring me to create a scene so he could crush me with his authority. The guests moved past as though I were invisible, stepping delicately around me as if I were an obstacle, a piece of litter on the sidewalk. I felt the heat rise into my face, not from the sun, but from shame. And in that instant of public erasure, when my family walked away without even a backward glance, I realized the truth. I was not their daughter in this moment, not their sister. I was nothing more than a stain they had tried and failed to scrub out. My throat ached, but I would not cry. My nails dug into my palms, but I would not shake. If they wanted to make me invisible, I would turn invisibility into steel. Just as the usher prepared to physically move me aside, a new sound entered the scene. It was the quiet, authoritative purr of an engine that did not belong to the line of wedding guests. A sleek black sedan rolled to the curb, its government plates gleaming in the sun. The car door opened with a soft thud, and out stepped a man whose very presence rearranged the air around him. Judge Henry Wallace. Tall, silver-haired, his black robe, replaced today with a sharp suit, surveyed the crowd with an unhurried gaze that carried the weight of decades on the bench, conversations stilled. The usher straightened instinctively. My father shifted uncomfortably, a muscle twitching at his jawline. The judge's eyes found mine instantly, as though he had known all along where I would be standing. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable until he stopped before me. And then his voice, deep and carrying, cut through the hushed crowd with the finality of a gavel strike. "There you are. We were about to send out a search party. The front row is reserved for Your Honor, Clara Mitchell." The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of glass shattering, of expectations collapsing, of an entire narrative flipping upside down in a single breath. The usher's face drained of color, his tablet trembling in his hands. My father's eyes widened in disbelief. My mother's lips parted in a soundless gasp, and somewhere behind them, my sister Vanessa dropped her bouquet, white petals scattering like fragments of a broken lie. I felt every gaze swing back to me, the dismissed daughter, the outcast sister, the girl they had tried to erase. And in that heartbeat, when the title Your Honor echoed against the ancient church walls, I was no longer the girl left off the list. I was the storm they had never seen coming. Tell me, have you ever stood at the door of your own family's gathering and been told you did not belong? Have you ever felt the sting of erasure in front of a crowd who laughed at your exclusion? Leave your story below, because today, mine begins here. My name is Clara Mitchell, and at 19 years old, I was caught between two worlds that never seemed to touch. On one side was the world of my family, where appearances mattered more than truth, where control was disguised as tradition, and where every step I took was measured against the golden path laid out for my older sister Vanessa. On the other side was the quieter, harder path I had chosen for myself, the world of textbooks, late nights in the library, and whispered encouragement from mentors who saw potential where my parents saw only rebellion. I was a pre-law student at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, the state capital, a campus alive with red brick buildings and the constant hum of ambition. For most students, the biggest concerns were exams and football games, but for me, every lecture on constitutional law, every case study I pored over in the hushed reading rooms of the law library felt like a rope. I was climbing out of a pit my family had dug around me. At home in Charleston in the Mitchell household, life was not lived, it was commanded. My father, Richard Mitchell, a retired Navy officer, carried the authority of the military into our living room, into our kitchen, into every word he spoke. Discipline was his gospel and control was his weapon. His voice was sharp, his expectations sharper. He believed he could mold daughters the way he had drilled sailors with barked orders and punishment for disobedience. My mother, Linda, was a softer echo of his control, her smiles sweet, but her loyalty unwavering. She polished Vanessa until she gleamed like a trophy and treated me like the dust that dulled her shine. To them, Vanessa was the ideal, the beautiful daughter who had always been adored, the one who won beauty pageants and dated the right kind of boys. She was now 22, preparing to marry Mark Harrison, a rising lawyer from Atlanta, with a pedigree that made my parents beam with pride. His family had money, his career had promise, and his name looked perfect next to hers on the engraved wedding invitations. It was the match my parents had dreamed of, the union that would elevate the Mitchells in the eyes of their community. And in that dream, there was no place for me. I was the misfit, the one who questioned orders, the one who read instead of performed, the one who never quite knew how to smile on command. My father often reminded me that the Navy made him the man he was, and he would snap his belt against his palm to make sure I understood the cost of disobedience. My mother, when she thought she was being gentle, would remind me with a sigh that I should learn from Vanessa's grace that not every girl was meant to argue or challenge, some were meant to support. Vanessa absorbed their adoration like sunlight, and she bloomed under it. She carried herself with a confidence that seemed to grow every time they cut me down, as if my shrinking made her stand taller. She loved me in the way one loves a rival, to be bested with a smile that never reached her eyes. In family photographs, she shone in the center while I was pushed to the side, half hidden behind shoulders cropped out by indifference. Our house in Charleston was large enough to echo a two-story colonial with white columns and a manicured lawn that was more for show than for living. Inside the walls were lined with portraits of Richard in his navy whites, of Vanessa holding sashes and crowns of family gatherings where I was present but not seen. My achievements were nowhere on display. My debate trophies, my certificates, my awards, they were kept in boxes under my bed, away from the family narrative. It was as if my story belonged only in shadows. Yet beyond that house on the streets of Columbia, I was building something they could not touch. I was known by professors as a sharp mind, someone who asked questions that made others pause. I had found a mentor in Judge Henry Wallace, who had agreed to let me intern quietly in his office in Charleston. Under his guidance, I learned that justice was not just an idea, but a craft built with patience, evidence, and an unshakable will. To him, I was not a disappointment. I was a student, a voice, a mind worth sharpening. That secret part of my life was what kept me steady when my family tried to break me. I would return home on weekends and feel the weight of my father's disapproval, the sting of my mother's comparisons, the mocking laughter of Vanessa and her friends. They saw me as a girl wasting her youth on books, playing at a career she would never reach. They did not know that late at night in the law library, surrounded by stacks of case law, I was shaping myself into something they could neither predict nor control. Charleston itself was a city of contrasts, and in many ways it mirrored my life. The historic downtown glowed with cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and pastel antebellum houses that whispered of tradition and hierarchy. Yet just a few blocks away, the university campus buzzed with youthful energy, with students from every background chasing futures bigger than the past. I lived between those worlds, caught in the pull of both. My family wanted me to bow to tradition, to marry well, to play the quiet role Vanessa perfected. My heart wanted to fight for something else, to step into a courtroom one day, not as a spectator, but as a voice that mattered. That tension defined me. And so, on the day of Vanessa's wedding, as the heavy doors of Trinity United Methodist closed in my face, it was not just about a missing name on a guest list. It was about years of erasure, years of being told I was less, years of being silenced. To them, I was an inconvenience. To myself, I was becoming a storm. And as Judge Wallace's voice echoed across the courtyard, calling me, "Your Honor," I felt for the first time that the two worlds I lived in were about to collide in front of everyone who had ever doubted me. When I think back on my childhood, the moments that should have defined me are not the ones that come first. Not the birthdays with cake, not the summers at the beach, not the quiet evenings when cicadas sang outside the windows. No, what returns to me first are the echoes of comparisons, the subtle cuts of neglect, the loud declarations that Vanessa was everything and I was nothing. I remember the day I won the state championship for public speaking, a competition that had taken months of practice and countless hours of rehearsals. I stood in front of a crowded auditorium in Columbia, my voice steady, my arguments sharp, my heart pounding with the thrill of being heard. When they handed me the trophy and the certificate with my name embossed in gold, I thought for once my parents would look at me the way they looked at Vanessa. But when I returned home carrying the award in trembling hands, I found the living room empty. They had gone to Vanessa's rehearsal for a local beauty pageant. My father never asked how the competition went. My mother never hung the certificate on the wall. It was placed on my desk unnoticed until eventually it ended up in a box beneath my bed. Contrast that with Vanessa's pageant crown a week later. The house transformed into a celebration hall. My father grilled steaks in the backyard, neighbors poured in balloons tied to the porch, fluttered in the humid breeze. A banner stretched across the fence read, "Congratulations, Vanessa, our star." She paraded through the yard, wearing her sash, while my mother carried a tray of lemonade, smiling as if her life had been made whole by this crowning moment. I clapped. I smiled, but inside I was invisible. That was the rhythm of my childhood. My victories were whispers, hers were parades. My dreams were dismissed, hers were platforms. I began to understand that in our house, love was conditional, and I had failed the test before I could even take it. Discipline was my father's other language, and when I stumbled, he translated his disappointment into punishment. One afternoon when I came home late from school because I had stayed behind for debate practice, he was waiting in the kitchen. His eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "You think the world will bend to your excuses, Clara?" In his hand, he snapped his belt against his palm, a sharp crack that made me flinch. He never needed to use it more than once to make his point. The sting was less painful than the words that followed. "You will never measure up if you cannot obey." I carried that bruise in silence, learning quickly that speaking out meant more discipline, more shame. My mother, instead of shielding me, reinforced his authority. I recall a dinner when I dared to question why Vanessa was excused from chores while I was ordered to clear the table. My mother's eyes hardened, her voice rose, and in her anger she struck a plate against the counter so hard it shattered. Shards flew across the kitchen floor, the noise louder than my heartbeat. "You will never be like your sister!" she shouted, and the words felt heavier than the broken porcelain at my feet. In that moment, I understood I was not just unloved. I was unwanted in the narrative of their perfect family. My escape became the library. The Charleston County Public Library was a sanctuary, cool and quiet, with rows of shelves that did not judge or compare. I spent hours there burying myself in books about history, law, philosophy, anything that told me there were worlds beyond the narrow cage of my home. It was in that refuge that I met Mrs. Ellen Harper, a guidance counselor who volunteered with students who needed extra support. She noticed me sitting alone with piles of case law and debate manuals, and one evening she asked gently why I studied so hard when I seemed so tired. For the first time, I told someone the truth, not all of it, but enough. She listened, she nodded, and she told me words that stitched a wound I had carried silently. Clara, she said, your mind is sharper than you know. You were not made to be quiet. You were made to stand in front of others and speak for what is right. That conversation planted a seed that my family could never uproot. While they told me I was less, she told me I was more. I carried her words like a secret weapon, hidden but powerful. And as I grew older, each betrayal at home only watered that seed, pushing it deeper, making it stronger. By the time I was 16, I had already learned to hide my achievements, to fold them away where they could not be mocked. But inside, I was building a fortress of proof that one day I would reveal. By the time I reached high school, I had mastered the art of disappearing. I learned how to walk into a room without drawing attention, how to keep my head down at the dinner table, how to respond with yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, so my father's temper would stay dormant at least for a while. But invisibility did not shield me from the hierarchy my family worshipped. Vanessa was the golden child, the bright star that drew all light, and I was the shadow cast behind her. When she became cheer captain, the living room was filled with flowers, banners, and congratulatory phone calls. My father toasted to her with a glass of bourbon, declaring that leadership ran in the Mitchell bloodline. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I held my tongue. That same semester, I won the regional debate championship, beating students from wealthier schools in Savannah and Atlanta. I came home with a medal around my neck, but my parents never mentioned it to a single neighbor. The medal lay in my desk drawer, unseen, while Vanessa's cheer trophy gleamed in the living room. What hurt was not just the neglect, but the message that followed. At dinner, my father leaned back in his chair, his voice loud and sure. Clara, you spend too much time talking. Real strength comes from action, not arguments. Vanessa leads with presence, and that is what matters. His words left no room for reply, and I swallowed my pride like dry bread. The message was clear. My skills were useless in their world. Their world demanded obedience, beauty, charm. Mine offered only logic and persistence, qualities they dismissed as second-rate. The betrayal deepened the night of my 17th birthday. I had planned nothing grand, just a small dinner with 2 friends from school. They brought a cake they had baked uneven and slightly burned, but it meant more to me than any gift. When my parents came home that evening, my father scowled at the half-eaten cake on the counter. "Birthdays are for children, Clara," he said flatly. Then he turned to Vanessa, who had waltzed in wearing a new dress. "But you darling look like a woman already." He kissed her on the cheek, and I stood there invisible in my own kitchen, holding plates no one would clear for me. Later that night, when my friends had left, I heard Vanessa laughing in her room, retelling the story of how my birthday had been forgotten. My mother's voice joined her soft, indulgent approving. That laughter cut deeper than any belt. Violence was never far away. My father believed in discipline with a physical hand. One Saturday morning, after a storm had knocked branches into the yard, he demanded I clear them before breakfast. I had been up all night finishing an essay for my AP government class, and I moved too slowly. His anger erupted like thunder. He shoved a chair against the wall so hard it cracked, and then he shoved me outside, barefoot, shouting that I would not eat until the yard was spotless. My mother stood at the window, arms folded, saying nothing. That silence burned more than his shouting. It told me she would never stand against him, never choose me over the image of a perfect family she wanted to protect. I remember my hands trembling as I dragged branches across wet grass, my stomach empty, my spirit heavy, until finally I collapsed on the porch, too tired to cry. In those years, I discovered a pattern that kept me alive. Whenever the house grew heavy with anger, I left. The library became more than a refuge, it became a lifeline. Mrs. Ellen Harper always seemed to know when I needed encouragement. She guided me toward law books, case studies, and stories of advocates who had fought battles with words instead of fists. She gave me a battered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird with her own notes in the margins and told me that standing up for truth was never wasted, even if the world ignored you. I read those pages under my blanket at night with a flashlight, the words becoming both shield and sword. They told me I was not alone, that justice was not just a word, but a possibility. As Vanessa grew older, her cruelty became more deliberate. She had learned from my parents that I was the easy target, the expendable sister. She mocked my clothes, my grades, even the way I walked. One evening, when she was surrounded by friends in our living room, she announced loudly that Clara wants to be a lawyer, but she cannot even win an argument at this table. The laughter that followed was sharp and merciless. My father smirked, my mother rolled her eyes, and I excused myself to the library once again. In those humiliations, a different kind of determination grew inside me. If they would not recognize me, I would build a life so undeniable that one day they would choke on their own words. The summer before I left for college, the final straw came. I had been offered a small scholarship to the University of South Carolina for pre-law studies. It was not enough to cover everything, but it was proof that someone saw potential in me. I printed the letter, laid it on the kitchen table, and waited for my parents to come home. My father picked it up, scanned it for a moment, then set it down. "So you will study paperwork," he muttered. "The family needs soldiers, not clerks." Vanessa laughed and chimed in, "Maybe you can file my wedding license one day." My mother did not congratulate me. She only asked if the scholarship would mean less money they had to spend on me. In that instant, I knew. There would never be approval, never be acceptance, not in that house. Whatever I achieved, I would achieve in spite of them, not because of them. I carried all those wounds, all those betrayals with me when I stepped onto the campus in Columbia. I carried the forgotten birthday, the shattered plate, the bruises, the laughter, the silence. And yet somewhere inside, I also carried the quiet voice of Mrs. Harper, reminding me that I had a weapon they could not touch. My words, my persistence, my belief in justice. They had told me over and over that I did not belong, but deep down I believed one day, somehow, I would prove them wrong. Secrets are heavy things. They rest on your shoulders quietly unseen by those who underestimate you, and yet they can shape every choice you make. For 2 years, I carried one that even my own family could not have imagined, because while they dismissed me as nothing more than a lost cause or a future clerk, I was walking into a world they would never touch. My sanctuary, the Charleston County Courthouse, was not just a place of solemn oaths and wooden benches polished by decades of use. It was the building where I became more than just the forgotten daughter. Through Mrs. Harper's connections, I secured an internship with Judge Henry Wallace, a man whose reputation was almost mythic in our city. He was respected by politicians, feared by criminals, and known by families as a voice of reason when tempers threatened to tear communities apart. To me, he became more than a mentor. He became proof that there were people in the world who could look at me and see more than my failures. At first, I was only allowed to observe hearings carrying files from one room to another, learning how cases flowed. But soon, he invited me to sit with him during recesses to discuss not just law, but life integrity and the choices that define who we are. I was 19, but he treated me like an equal. He once told me, "Clara's strength is not in the volume of your voice, but in the weight of your truth." Those words lodged deep in my chest, a counterweight to every insult hurled at me in my own house. Working under him, I began to see the mechanics of justice, not as abstract theory, but as living, breathing battles. I saw mothers fight for custody of children, workers stand against corrupt employers, and neighbors seek protection from violence. Each case reminded me of home, of the silence that had caged me for years. Every story whispers to me that my pain was not isolated, that toxic families and abuse of power were everywhere, hidden behind polished doors and Sunday smiles. I was determined to learn not only how to survive, but how to fight back intelligently. Judge Wallace, with his stern but kind demeanor, encouraged me to study patterns, to follow evidence, to build arguments as carefully as soldiers build defenses. He never asked about my family, but perhaps he sensed more than I admitted, because he often reminded me that one day the truth has a way of demanding light. So I began quietly gathering pieces like a lawyer building a case no one else knew existed. At home, I copied documents left carelessly on the dining table. I memorized the numbers scrawled in my father's notebook's debts he kept hidden under false accounts. I forwarded emails from my mother's computer to a private drive messages that discussed how to force me into signing away any future claim to our family's property. I saved text messages from Vanessa, cruel taunts written late at night, sometimes even threats that if I caused trouble, she would call the police and claim I had attacked her. Each scrap of proof was tucked away onto a USB drive I kept hidden inside the lining of my school bag, a silent vault of their hypocrisy. I did not know when I might use it, but just knowing it was there gave me strength. It was as if for once the balance of power had shifted even if they could not see it. The irony was bitter. My parents saw me as weak, fragile, unable to survive without their rules, but I was the only one who truly knew how fragile their own facade was. My father's public image as a disciplined ex-Navy officer masked his gambling debts and his outbursts of violence. My mother's reputation as a devoted churchwoman hid her complicity in silencing me and protecting Vanessa. And Vanessa herself, poised to marry a wealthy young lawyer from Atlanta, lived with the arrogance of someone who believed her lies would never catch up with her. They thought I was powerless, and in their arrogance, they left cracks wide enough for me to step through. Still, secrecy came with a cost. I walked through my days at home in silence, knowing that if they discovered what I was collecting, there would be consequences I might not survive. I became adept at pretending. When my father barked orders, I nodded. When my mother criticized me, I bit my tongue. When Vanessa smirked, I forced myself to smile. All the while, my mind was cataloging every detail, every inconsistency, every careless word. I was not their prisoner anymore. I was an observer inside enemy territory, and with each passing month, I grew more certain that the day would come when I would no longer hide. The truth I carried would be my weapon, and when I finally revealed it, there would be no undoing the damage. They had told me my whole life that I did not belong. I intended to show them with undeniable proof that I had always belonged in a place they feared most, the truth. Carrying that secret was like living with a double life. At the courthouse, I was Clara Mitchell, the eager intern who impressed Judge Wallace with careful notes, sharp questions, and the ability to see through half-truths in testimony. At home, I was still the daughter who kept her eyes lowered at the dinner table, who washed dishes in silence, who endured Vanessa's taunts as if they were natural weather. The contrast was almost unbearable. Every morning when I walked through the courthouse doors, the world seemed brighter, the air cleaner, as though the heavy humidity of Charleston could not cling to me in that sacred place. Judge Wallace trusted me with more responsibility, letting me draft memos, summarize cases, even research precedents that found their way into his rulings. I could feel myself growing, taking shape, becoming the woman my parents refused to see. Yet I never spoke a word of it at home. To them, I was still wasting time. To them, I was nothing, and perhaps that invisibility was my greatest protection. I remember one particular evening when the weight of both lives collided. I had just returned from the courthouse, still buzzing from a hearing where Wallace had quoted a passage I had researched. My heart was still pounding with pride when I walked into the kitchen. My father was at the table, a bottle of bourbon half empty in front of him, muttering over a stack of bills. My mother stood at the counter, her back rigid, her hands clenched too tightly on a dish towel. Vanessa lounged nearby, scrolling through her phone. Without looking up, my father growled that I should take out the trash. The command was ordinary, but something inside me shifted. I obeyed as I always did, but while tying the bag, I caught a glimpse of the red overdue stamp on one of his letters. Debt collectors. He had been hiding them from the family, yet leaving the papers where I could see them. That night, I added another note to my private file. His image as a proud, disciplined veteran was a mask, and I was peeling it away piece by piece. Sometimes I asked myself why I kept collecting, why I did not simply leave and never look back. But then I remembered every bruise, every shattered plate, every birthday ignored, every time they said I was less. Gathering evidence was not just for survival. It was for justice. It was for the day when silence would no longer protect them, when their own actions would betray them before witnesses who could not be fooled. The irony was that Vanessa and my parents loved to talk about appearances. They obsessed over who saw them at church, who invited them to social events, what the neighbors whispered. They spent so much energy building a perfect image that they never noticed the cracks spreading underneath. They never realized that the daughter they dismissed had been quietly documenting everything that could tear that image apart. Judge Wallace never asked about my home life directly, but he gave me a kind of permission without naming it. One afternoon, while reviewing a domestic violence case, he told me that silence often enables cruelty more than fists ever do. He looked at me then, steady and unblinking, as though daring me to hear what he was really saying. "Speak when the time is right, Clara," he said. That sentence replayed in my mind each night as I hid my USB drive beneath a false bottom in my dresser drawer. He did not know the details, but he had given me a compass, and I was determined to follow it. By the time Vanessa's wedding was announced, my secret was no longer just preparation. It was a promise. I knew the guest list would not include me. I knew my parents would find some way to humiliate me. But I also knew I would not arrive empty-handed. In my purse on that day, along with my wallet and phone, would be the tiny drive containing every record, every email, every text. I would carry the truth like a dagger hidden in silk. And though I had no plan for how or when to use it, I trusted that the moment would reveal itself. I trusted that the years of silence would not end with another dismissal, but with a reckoning. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me, because for the first time in my life, I did not fear my family's power. I held something stronger. I held the truth, and it was mine alone to reveal. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the atmosphere in our house grew thick with tension, though no one acknowledged it. Charleston's summer air clung to everything heavy and unrelenting, and inside our home it felt no different. My mother busied herself with preparations as if orchestrating a royal event. Every conversation revolved around floral arrangements, catering menus, and the perfect shade of cream for Vanessa's gown. My father barked orders about guest seating, insisting that only those who mattered should be near the front. I was barely addressed except to be reminded not to cause trouble. The irony was sharp. They saw me as a potential embarrassment while I carried the one truth that could dismantle their performance. I listened to them rehearse lies and casual sentences, smoothing over debts, pretending there was unity in the Mitchell family. Every word felt like kindling piling up, waiting for the smallest spark. I overheard my mother one evening while she was on the phone with a church friend. "Clara will not be there," she said with a sigh that sounded almost satisfied. "She has nothing to offer compared to Vanessa." My stomach clenched, but I did not interrupt. Instead, I wrote the words down in a small notebook I carried everywhere, a habit I had developed from the courthouse. Record everything Wallace always told me because memory is fragile and facts are not. Their contempt was no longer just noise, it was evidence. The night before the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my room, holding up the simple navy blue dress I had chosen. It was modest, unadorned, a deliberate choice not to draw attention. I wanted no accusations of trying to outshine the bride, but the purse I set beside it told a different story. Inside lay the small USB drive, a weapon made of data dates and undeniable words. I slipped it in and out of the pocket, feeling its weight, imagining the moment when it might be revealed. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, equal parts fear and anticipation. I whispered to my reflection, tomorrow is not theirs alone. At the rehearsal dinner, which I had not been officially invited to but had wandered close enough to observe, I saw Vanessa glide through the crowd with Mark at her side, radiant in her role as golden child. Mark, the young lawyer from Atlanta, shook hands confidently with guests already part of the family's image of success. I watched from a distance as my father raised a glass, his voice booming with pride, declaring Vanessa the pride of the Mitchell name. His words landed like familiar blows. I knew he would never raise a glass for me, but even as the sting settled, I felt something new, the calm of someone who no longer craved that toast. That night, when I lay awake, I rehearsed my silence, because silence could be as sharp as speech when wielded at the right moment. I pictured walking into the church not as an uninvited guest, but as someone whose name carried weight, someone who had earned a seat at the front row, even if they had tried to erase me from the list. I pictured the look on their faces when their control slipped away. I reminded myself not to rush, not to let anger make me reckless. Timing. Wallace always said is everything in law and in life. Tomorrow I would wait. I would let them believe they had won. And then I would show them just how wrong they were. Morning arrived too quickly, the June sun already hot enough to press sweat into my skin before I even stepped outside. Charleston's streets shimmered as I drove toward the church, the Trinity United Methodist, its white steeple piercing the sky like a judgmental finger. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the small purse with the USB resting on the passenger seat like a silent companion. Each stoplight felt like a test of my resolve every second, reminding me I was driving not just to a wedding, but to a reckoning. My family thought they had written me out of this script, that their perfect show would go on without interruption, but they had no idea that the quiet daughter they underestimated carried the power to collapse their stage. When I parked a block away, I paused to steady my breath. Around me, families in polished clothes streamed toward the church, women in pastel dresses, men in tailored suits, laughter spilling into the heavy air. I walked, slowly blending in my navy dress plain enough not to attract glances. Inside me, though, the storm churned. I could already hear the sharp whisper of my mother telling guests that I was nothing. See my father scowling at the idea of me even stepping foot inside. I felt the weight of their rejection pressing down, but beneath it, a different sensation pulsed. Readiness. At the church steps, I caught sight of Vanessa greeting guests. She looked radiant, glowing with the assurance of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. When her eyes met mine, just for a flicker of a moment, her lips curved into a smirk. Not a smile of welcome, but a reminder you are not wanted here. That smirk hit me like a slap, but I kept walking, my face neutral, my eyes steady. I had learned from Wallace how to mask emotions until the exact right moment. Inside the sanctuary hummed with conversation, the organist testing soft chords, ushers guiding guests to their seats. I slipped into a pew near the back, unacknowledged, unnoticed. For a moment, I allowed myself to close my eyes and breathe in the scent of polished wood and old hymnals. It grounded me. I reminded myself that I was not here to beg for space. I was here to let truth find its place. The conversations around me blurred into a low buzz until I caught my mother's voice. She stood near the front, speaking to a group of churchwomen, her tone confident, rehearsed. "Clara won't be here," she said again, as if declaring it would make it true. "She doesn't belong in this story." My jaw clenched, but I kept still. The women nodded politely, some glancing toward me without recognition, assuming I was just another distant guest. I wrote the words down later in the margins of my program. Every insult was another brick in the wall they had built between us, and every brick was now part of the evidence I carried. As I waited, I slid my hand into my purse, touching the edge of the USB. It was small, ordinary, but it contained years of silence, years of bruises, years of secrets. It felt cold against my fingers, like steel. I whispered to myself, "Not today, not yet, patience. The right moment will come. Timing, always timing." The organ swelled louder, signaling that the ceremony was moments from beginning. Guests shuffled into place, their voices falling to murmurs of reverence. My father walked with Vanessa down the aisle, his chest puffed, his hand firm on her arm. He did not look at me, but I could feel his disdain radiating like heat. My mother followed pearls around her neck, her chin lifted with pride. They were all playing their roles perfectly, the family of honor, while I remained the ghost in the pews. Yet ghosts, I reminded myself, have a way of haunting. I did not know exactly how the day would unfold, but I knew the performance they had built was fragile, and I had the truth ready to break it. The sun was already high when I reached the steps of Trinity United Methodist, and the white stone of the church seemed to shimmer with a cruel kind of beauty. Guests were filing in, their laughter echoing in the warm air, their shoes clicking against the old bricks. My heart pounded as I took my place on the front steps, determined not to cower, but the moment I approached the heavy wooden doors, an usher in a crisp suit blocked my way. I froze. His voice was polite but firm, rehearsed in its professionalism. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not on the list." His words carried louder than he intended, and heads turned toward me, curiosity sparking in the crowd. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe he had made a mistake, but when he turned the clipboard toward me and I scanned the names written neatly in black ink, mine was absent. Vanessa Mitchell, Richard and Linda Mitchell, Mark Harrison, rows of family and friends, but no Clara. A strange coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips. It wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. Behind me, I heard a familiar laugh, sharp and satisfied. My cousin Thomas, always eager to join the cruelty, leaned in just close enough to whisper, "Not on the list, Clara." Guess they knew better. His smirk widened when I clenched my fists, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. Still, my silence didn't shield me. Within seconds, Vanessa appeared at the door in her lace gown, glowing with staged perfection. She let her eyes sweep over me, then turned to the usher with a practiced sigh. "It's fine. She doesn't belong here." The words rang like a gavel in my skull. My mother, standing a few feet away with a cluster of guests, pretended to adjust the pearls at her neck. My father scowled, his hand tightening on his cufflinks, as though the sight of me had already stained his image. Their refusal to acknowledge me hurt worse than the words themselves. It was not rejection, it was erasure. The usher hesitated, his eyes flicking between Vanessa's cold certainty and my quiet defiance. I could feel the weight of the watching crowd pressing against me, dozens of eyes waiting to see if I would make a scene, waiting to see if the forgotten daughter would crumble. My cheeks burned, my pulse raced. For a moment, I thought I might falter. The air thickened, every sound muffled except for the echo of my own breath. But then a memory rose sharp as glass the night my mother shattered a plate and told me I would never be like my sister. That same icy numbness filled me now. They could humiliate me in front of their friends, but I would not give them my tears. Not today. The usher finally cleared his throat, his voice strained. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, ma'am." He gestured gently toward the edge of the steps, as if moving me out of the frame of a photograph. My legs refused to move. For a moment, I stood rooted to the spot, the world narrowing into a tunnel where only the sound of my family's contempt echoed. Guests murmured whispers rippling like waves. "She wasn't invited. Did you hear what Vanessa said, poor thing?" My vision blurred not with tears, but with a rage so sharp it steadied me. They thought this was victory. They thought erasing me from the program meant erasing me from existence. And then, at the height of that silence, the sound arrived. A low, commanding engine, the kind you only heard in official convoys, rolled to a stop at the curb. The rear door opened, and Judge Henry Wallace stepped out, his presence larger than the church itself. Dressed in his dark suit, his silver hair catching the sunlight, he carried an authority that made the crowd instinctively hush. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Vanessa faltered, her hand tightening on her bouquet. My father's jaw clenched, his mask cracking for the briefest second. Judge Wallace's eyes swept across the steps, landing on me with the kind of recognition that burned away invisibility. And then, in a voice that carried effortlessly across the crowd, he said words that detonated in the air like a bomb. "There you are, Your Honor, Clara Mitchell. Front row is waiting." The crowd gasped. The usher's eyes widened in horror, the clipboard nearly slipping from his hands. Vanessa's bouquet tumbled to the ground, petals scattering like confetti from a parade gone wrong. My mother clutched her pearls so tightly I thought they might snap. My father stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief. And me, I stood frozen, the world spinning as those words echoed in my ears. "Your Honor," not daughter, not sister, not failure. "Your Honor." The usher snapped to attention, his voice stumbling with panic. "Admiral, I mean." "Your Honor. My apologies. Right this way." His salute was so sharp it might have cut the air. He rushed to swing the heavy door open, his earlier authority replaced by trembling deference. Guests shifted, whispering frantically, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Who was I? What had just happened? Wallace extended his arm to me, steady and unyielding. I placed my hand on it, my steps deliberate as we walked past my family. I did not look at them, but I felt their eyes burning into my back. My father's disbelieving whisper reached me anyway. "Judge, what the hell?" But I kept walking, chin high, breath steady. The sanctuary opened before me, rows of guests turning in their seats to watch, and for the first time in my life, every eye that had once looked past me now followed me. The organ swelled again, filling the church with sound, but underneath it, I heard the silence of my family's collapse. They had erased my name from the list, but now it was the only one anyone was whispering. Clara Mitchell. Your Honor. The sanctuary was hushed as Judge Wallace guided me down the aisle, his hand firm on my elbow, each step echoing on the polished wooden floor. The air was thick with perfume flowers and the weight of whispers. Guests craned their necks, eyes wide, murmuring questions that fluttered like restless wings above the pews. I kept my chin high, forcing my body to move with the calm grace Wallace had always demanded from me in court. This was no longer about entering a church. This was about walking into the truth I had been denied my entire life. The front pew reserved for family loomed closer. My father's face was pale rigid as if carved from stone, his lips pressed into a thin line. My mother fanned herself rapidly with the ceremony program, her eyes darting between me and the guests as though trying to calculate how to spin what was unraveling. Vanessa's hands shook, clutching her bouquet so tightly that stems snapped drops of water staining her dress. When we reached the front, Wallace pulled out the program from his breast pocket and slipped it into the usher's trembling hands. "Add her name," he said calmly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. Then he turned to me with the same warmth he always carried in chambers. "Your seat is here, Clara. Front row. With us." The guests shifted again, whispers rising in pitch. I sat my back straight, the two words still ringing in my head. With us. For the first time, I belonged somewhere. The ceremony began, the organ swelled, and Vanessa floated down the aisle like a queen taking her throne. Mark beamed, unaware that the stage around him was collapsing. The pastor welcomed everyone, his voice steady, trying to carry on as if the air was not charged with electricity. My mother leaned close to my father, her whisper sharp. "Do something." But there was nothing he could do. Authority had already shifted. Judge Wallace's presence had silenced every weapon they once used against me. I felt their stares on me hot and desperate, but I did not turn. Instead, I focused on the altar, on the candles flickering like witnesses to what was unfolding. Every word of the vows, every hymn felt like a drumbeat, pushing us closer to the moment when the facade would crumble. Vanessa recited her lines, her voice confident, but I saw the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes kept flicking toward me. She had spent her entire life performing for admiration. Now she was competing with a truth she could not control. When the vows ended and applause scattered through the pews, Wallace rose before anyone else. His movements drew the eye of the entire room. Without waiting for permission, he approached the podium. The pastor stepped aside, recognizing authority when he saw it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wallace began, his voice resonant, carrying to the farthest corner of the sanctuary. "Before we toast this union, there is another matter of honor we must recognize today." The room stilled. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hand gripping the pew so hard his knuckles whitened. Vanessa's smile faltered. Mark glanced between us, confusion etching across his face. Wallace continued, his tone deliberate, each word carrying the weight of judgment. "We rightly celebrate those who stand in the light, but there are others who serve in silence, unseen, their contributions dismissed until the truth can no longer be hidden. Today we must recognize such a servant." His eyes found mine. "Clara Mitchell, you have shown a strength beyond your years." Gasps rippled across the sanctuary. I felt heat rise in my face, but I held still. Wallace pressed forward. "For years, Clara has carried the discipline, intelligence, and courage of someone determined to uphold justice, even when her own family chose to ignore it. She has assisted this court, this city, and this community in ways most of you will never know. Today, I will not allow her to be erased from her own story." The words detonated like thunder. My father muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Vanessa's face drained of color, her hands trembling. My mother's fan stilled in midair. Guests leaned forward, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Clara working with Wallace evidence. "What does he mean?" Wallace paused, letting the tension stretch, then spoke again. "Families may fail us, but truth does not. And today, truth deserves its place in this room." He gestured toward me. Stand, Clara. My legs felt heavy, but I rose the weight of 1,000 slights lifting as I straightened. The guests erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling until the sanctuary echoed with clapping. People I had never met looked at me with respect that my family had denied me all my life. I glanced across the aisle, meeting my father's eyes for the briefest moment. He looked away first. Vanessa stared at me as if I had stolen her crown, her lips parting in shock. My mother's face was tight eyes, wet, torn between pride and shame. I gave them nothing. No smile, no frown, just silence. That silence was louder than any speech I could have given. When the applause finally died, Wallace concluded, "Let this day be not only a union of two lives, but a reminder that justice and courage belong in every story, even those written in shadows." He stepped back and the pastor awkwardly resumed, but the energy had shifted. The wedding was no longer Vanessa's flawless performance. It was my unveiling. As I sat again, the truth settled in my chest with a calm finality. I had not needed to shout. I had not needed to beg. The evidence waited quietly in my purse, but today it was not even necessary. Recognition itself was victory. For once, the entire room had seen me, and my family could not erase what had been spoken aloud. The reception hall was buzzing with music and clinking glasses, but beneath the hum of conversation, there was a tension I could feel vibrating through the air. I had barely taken a sip of water when I saw them coming. My father, my mother, and Vanessa cutting through the crowd like a storm front rolling in from the sea. Mark trailed behind, confusion etched into his face, but it was clear this confrontation belonged to the Mitchells. They didn't bother with polite smiles or whispered discretion. My father's hand clamped down on my arm, his grip iron, his voice low but shaking with barely restrained fury. "Come with us now." He dragged me toward a side door that led into a narrow hallway, my heels clicking on the polished floor as I struggled to keep my balance. My mother followed, her face pale, her pearl necklace trembling against her collarbone as though she knew the dam was about to break. Vanessa stormed behind them, her wedding dress sweeping angrily across the floor, her bouquet discarded somewhere along the way. They shoved me into a small side room, the kind used for storing coats and extra chairs, and shut the door. The music from the reception muffled into a distant thrum, leaving us in the oppressive silence of four walls. My father was the first to break it. His hand came down across my face in a crack that stunned me more with its familiarity than its pain. "You humiliated us." He spat, his voice thick with rage. "In front of everyone, you made this family a spectacle." I staggered but held my ground, my palm pressing against the burning skin of my cheek. The old instinct to shrink to apologize flared for an instant, but I had outgrown that. Instead, I reached into my purse with deliberate slowness, pulled out the small USB drive, and held it up between us like a shard of glass catching the light. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "This contains the truth," I said calmly. "Every debt you've hidden, every email Mom has written about forcing me to give up my inheritance, every cruel message Vanessa ever sent. You think I humiliated you today? No. This is humiliation, waiting." My father froze, his chest rising and falling in shallow, angry breaths. My mother gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth, eyes darting between us. Vanessa exploded, her voice a shriek that cracked in the small room. "This is my day, Clara. You ruined everything. You always find a way to ruin it." Her words would have once gutted me, but now they rolled off like water against stone. I looked at her squarely and replied, "No. This is the day truth walked in." That silenced her. For a long, taut moment, the only sound was the muffled throb of music from the hall beyond the door. My father's jaw clenched, his fists tightening and releasing at his sides. He looked at the USB as if it were a loaded weapon, which in many ways it was. My mother began to cry quietly, her tears streaking through her carefully applied makeup. I felt a strange clarity settle over me, cold and steady. They could shout, they could strike, but they no longer held power. That had shifted when Wallace spoke my name. Vanessa broke the silence again, her tone bitter, desperate. "You think anyone cares about your little secrets? You think Mark will leave me because of you?" She turned to her new husband, her voice rising. Tell her this changes nothing. But Mark's face was no longer confident. He looked at me, then at Vanessa, then at my father, his eyes narrowing as if he were piecing together a puzzle he hadn't known existed. What secrets, he asked slowly. What debts? What emails? His voice carried suspicion, not reassurance. For the first time, Vanessa faltered. I slipped the USB back into my purse and straightened my spine. I don't need to use it here, I said softly. But don't mistake my silence for weakness. The next time you try to erase me, the whole world will see what I've kept. I let the words hang in the air like smoke. My father's glare burned into me, but he didn't move. My mother whispered something, but her voice broke into sobs. Vanessa turned away, clutching the skirt of her gown, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. For the first time in 19 years, I felt taller than all of them. Not because I had shouted, not because I had begged, but because I had refused to break. The small room, once a prison of their anger, had become my courtroom. And the verdict was clear: they were guilty, not me. I opened the door before they could stop me, letting the light and music of the reception wash over me. People turned as I stepped back into the hall, their eyes following me with curiosity and, something else, respect. Behind me, the door closed on the chaos of my family's implosion. Ahead of me, the night stretched open, filled with the possibility of a new kind of freedom. When I stepped back into the reception hall, the room felt different, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension from the ceremony and were now waiting for release. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, reflecting in rows of wine glasses and polished silverware. Guests were clustered at tables, whispering with curiosity, eyes tracking me as I crossed the floor. I no longer tried to shrink beneath their gaze. For once, I let them see me. My family did not follow immediately, leaving me to walk alone, and in that solitude I found strength. Judge Wallace was standing near the stage, deep in conversation with a congressman from Columbia. When he saw me, he excused himself and extended his hand. "Clara," he said warmly, as though my presence was the most natural thing in the world. "Come, it's time." He guided me to the center of the hall, his calm authority commanding silence. Conversations died away. Chairs shifted, and soon every eye in the room was on us. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I held my head high. Wallace reached for the microphone, his voice steady, rich with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we raise our glasses to the bride and groom, allow me a moment to recognize another figure in this room." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. My heart thudded. Wallace continued. "Too often, families are celebrated only for appearances, the glitter, the ceremony, the roles we play. But true honor comes from integrity, from the courage to face truth even when it is unwelcome." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, and I saw my father re-enter the hall with my mother and Vanessa. Their faces were masks of strained composure, but the cracks showed. Vanessa clutched Mark's arm too tightly, her smile brittle. My father's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a chair. My mother's eyes darted nervously between the guests. They could sense what was coming, and they had no power to stop it. Wallace lifted his hand toward me. "Today I stand not only as a judge, but as a witness to a young woman's resilience. Clara Mitchell has shown extraordinary discipline, intelligence, and courage. For 2 years, she has served in my office, assisting in cases that touched the very core of this community. Her contributions have made a difference in lives you may never know, but I do, and I will not allow her to be diminished or erased." The silence shattered into applause, first hesitant, then swelling, until it filled the room like thunder. People rose to their feet, clapping, nodding, whispering her name. My name. Clara. Clara Mitchell. I felt heat in my face, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I stood taller, shoulders back, as the recognition I had hungered for my entire life poured over me from strangers rather than from those who shared my blood. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Vanessa's face. Her painted smile had collapsed into disbelief, her bouquet drooping as though it had wilted in her hands. Mark's expression had shifted too. He looked at Wallace, then at me, his eyes narrowing with realization. I could almost see the questions forming in his mind, the doubts unraveling the perfect image Vanessa had sold him. My father sank into a chair, his shoulders rigid, his eyes glassy with fury he could no longer unleash. My mother pressed a hand to her pearls as though trying to steady her breathing. When the applause finally ebbed, Wallace placed the microphone back on the stand, then leaned close to me so only I could hear. "You've earned this, Clara. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were steady, but they cut through me like light breaking through dark clouds. For once, I believed them. As Wallace stepped aside, the applause lingered like waves retreating slowly from shore. I stood alone in the center of the reception hall, every eye still fixed on me. The chandeliers above seemed brighter, the air lighter, though my chest was still tight from the weight of what had just happened. I could see my family huddled together near the side, their faces pale, their composure shattered. For once, they were not the center of attention. For once, the spotlight refused to obey them. The band tried to resume their music, but the rhythm faltered as guests kept whispering. I caught fragments of their words. I had no idea Clara worked for Wallace. Such poise for someone so young. Imagine being erased from your own sister's wedding. Their sympathy was not loud, but it was steady and it traveled quickly across the room. Each comment felt like a balm to old wounds. I wasn't invisible anymore. Mark finally detached himself from Vanessa and crossed toward me. His jaw was tight, his eyes searching. "Clara, is it true? Have you really been working with Judge Wallace?" I met his gaze squarely, my voice calm. "Yes, for 2 years." He blinked, absorbing the weight of that. He glanced back at Vanessa, whose lips pressed into a hard line. She looked away, her hand trembling against her gown. The rift between them was visible, and the guests noticed. That was the beginning of her unraveling. I returned to my seat at the front, Wallace on one side and a senator's wife on the other. People leaned over to shake my hand, offer congratulations, even small words of encouragement. I thanked them politely, my voice steady, though my hands still trembled under the table. My father never moved closer. He stayed rigid in his chair across the hall, his eyes fixed on the glass of bourbon in his hand. My mother whispered furiously in his ear, but he ignored her. Vanessa hovered in silence, her smile forced whenever a guest approached her, the strain showing in every line of her body. The toasts began. Friends of the groom spoke first, then relatives from Atlanta. Each speech was warm but subdued, as if they were wary of the energy that still hovered in the air. Finally, Wallace raised his glass. "To love, to truth, and to courage," he said simply. His gaze flicked toward me, and several guests echoed the gesture, their glasses lifted in my direction as well. I felt my throat tighten, but I raised mine too, letting the moment stand unchallenged. Later, as people rose to dance and the band finally found its rhythm, I remained seated watching. For once, I did not feel like an intruder. I felt like someone who had a place. A woman in her 50s leaned close to me, her voice low but kind. "My dear, you must be proud. Families can be blind, but we all saw what happened here today." Her words sank deep, soothing, and terrifying at once. It was real. It had happened. The image of my family's perfection had cracked in front of everyone, and no one could piece it back together. When the evening drew on, my family avoided me. My father slipped outside his shoulders, sagging in defeat. My mother clung to Vanessa, whispering frantically, but Vanessa's eyes were distant, fixed on Mark, who now kept his distance. The picture-perfect wedding had become a spectacle of fracture, and I had not lifted a hand to cause it. All I had done was stand. As the last song ended and guests began to leave, Wallace placed a hand on my shoulder. "Walk with me, Clara." We stepped outside into the humid Charleston night. The cicadas sang in the trees, the street lamps glowing softly. He turned to me, his expression solemn but kind. "You didn't just survive them. Today you showed them who you are. Remember that." His words anchored me. I nodded, the night air filling my lungs like a promise. For the first time, I knew the balance had shifted forever. They could no longer erase me. The world had seen me, and the truth could not be put back into silence. The days after the wedding unfolded like aftershocks from an earthquake. Charleston's gossip mills moved faster than any newspaper, faster than truth itself sometimes, but this time, truth was the only fuel they needed. By Monday, whispers about what had happened at Trinity United Methodist had spread across neighborhoods, church groups, and even the courthouse hallways where I spent my afternoons. Strangers who had once looked past me now paused to nod, to ask careful questions, to offer hushed congratulations. My name was no longer spoken as a shadow. It was linked with Wallace's, with justice, with resilience. For my family, it was the opposite. My father's name, once respected in veteran circles and church committees, became laced with suspicion. Men he had played cards with at the local VFW hall began avoiding his table. Rumors of gambling debts leaked, helped along by evidence I had already placed in Wallace's hands months before. By the end of the week, a quiet investigation had begun into his financial dealings. I didn't need to lift another finger. The system he once claimed to serve was now watching him. My mother, who had built her entire identity on the reputation of being a graceful, God-fearing matron, found herself suddenly isolated. The women at church who once sought her advice began whispering behind her back. Some had seen her clutching my arm too tightly, others had caught fragments of her cruel dismissal outside the church doors. In a community where appearances mattered more than scripture, her mask had cracked, and no amount of pearl necklaces could polish over the shame of being the mother who erased her own daughter. Vanessa's perfect marriage began to unravel before the ink on her license was dry. Mark, once dazzled by her charm, grew quiet and withdrawn. I had seen it in his eyes at the reception, the realization that the family he had married into was built on rot. Within 2 weeks, he stopped accompanying her to social dinners. By the end of the month, he had moved into a corporate apartment in Atlanta, leaving her to field questions alone. She tried to maintain her image, posting carefully staged photographs, but the comments beneath them told another story. People had seen her sneer, had heard her declare that I didn't belong. No filter could erase that. For me, the shift was disorienting. I had spent 19 years living as though unseen, and now eyes followed me everywhere. At the courthouse, clerks asked for my opinion on cases. Professors from the University of South Carolina reached out with invitations to panels. And one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail with the blue crest of Duke University embossed on the flap. Inside was a letter offering me a full scholarship to study law. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding it, my hands trembling, tears finally breaking free. It was the life I had dreamed of, the door opening wide when my own family had tried to bolt it shut. But the sweetest consequence was not in scholarships or applause. It was in the silence that settled over my family whenever I entered a room. For once, they had no words, no commands, no dismissals. They had only the weight of their own collapse pressing down on them. My father avoided my gaze, my mother busied herself with meaningless tasks, and Vanessa snapped at anyone who mentioned my name. I no longer needed their approval. Their disapproval had lost all power. Charleston is a city that remembers, and memory there is not kind. In the weeks after the wedding, my family learned that reputations collapse faster than they are built. My father was summoned quietly to a meeting with the Naval Veterans Board he once chaired. By the time he returned, his seat had been stripped. They did not say it was for gambling or for violence or for humiliation at a wedding, but everyone knew. His anger was a silent storm now turned inward because raising his voice only reminded people of the stories already swirling. He stopped going to the VFW hall altogether. Men who had once saluted him now looked through him as if he were just another old man clinging to the past. My mother's punishment came in smaller cuts, but they bled just the same. At church, her circle of admirers dwindled. The pastor, a man who prided himself on compassion, suggested gently that she step down from the women's ministry board for a season. She nodded with forced grace, but I saw the way her hands trembled on the hymnal the following Sunday. The same lips that had told me I did not belong now struggled to form smiles at potluck dinners. She, too, had been erased, though not by me, by her own words, finally exposed to the wrong ears. Vanessa bore the sharpest wound of all. Mark's departure became official when divorce papers arrived only 3 months into the marriage. The whispers in Charleston were merciless. A bride abandoned before the ink had dried, a wedding turned into scandal, a golden child tarnished. She tried to rebuild her image on social media, posting photographs of brunches in Atlanta or carefully staged outings with friends. But the comments told another story. People remembered the way she had smirked on the church steps, remembered her voice declaring I did not belong. Screenshots of that moment circulated quietly, proof of arrogance that could not be hidden. Her career ambitions modeling public relations faltered in the shadow of her own performance. For me, life bent toward light. Wallace invited me to sit in on more trials to shadow him not just as an intern, but as a mentee. He introduced me at luncheons at legal forums, always with the same phrase that still sent shivers through me. "This is Clara Mitchell, one of the most promising young legal minds I've seen." At first, I blushed, stumbling over polite responses, but gradually I learned to accept the recognition. Each word felt like a stone laid in the foundation of a life I was building for myself. When the Duke University scholarship letter arrived, I carried it to Wallace's office, my hands still trembling. He read it, nodded once, and said simply, "You've earned this. Charleston may have tried to break you, but you are bigger than this city now." His confidence steadied me more than the letter itself. For the first time, I saw my future not as survival, but as possibility. At home, the silence deepened. Meals passed with clinking forks and little else. My father no longer barked commands. My mother avoided my eyes. Vanessa rarely visited, and when she did, her voice carried bitterness instead of triumph. The house that had once felt like a prison now felt like a mausoleum filled with ghosts of their lost control. And I, once the invisible daughter, became the only one in the family still seen in public without shame. It was not revenge in the loud cinematic sense. It was slower, quieter, but no less devastating. The humiliation they had tried to force on me had rebounded, clinging to them instead. I did not need to shout their sins from rooftops. They revealed themselves when light finally reached them. And as I packed my bags for Durham, ready to begin at Duke, I realized that the truest consequence was not their fall. It was my rise beyond their reach. 6 months later, I found myself walking across the campus of Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, the winter air crisp, the Gothic spires of the chapel rising like sentinels against a pale sky. My breath came out in clouds, and for the first time in years, each exhale felt light, unburdened. I rented a small apartment near East Campus. Nothing grand, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and sunlight that poured in through tall windows in the morning. It was mine, wholly mine, without anyone's name on the lease but my own. That small fact meant more than I could explain. The city was different from Charleston, less suffocating, less tangled in the webs of gossip and family reputation. Here, no one knew me as Richard and Linda Mitchell's forgotten daughter. No one compared me to Vanessa. I was simply Clara, a law student who had earned her place. I could walk into classrooms without fear of whispers, raise my hand in seminars without hearing my father's mocking voice in my head. Freedom, I discovered, was not just a matter of geography. It was a matter of finally choosing where my story began. Still healing was not a straight path. Nights came when memories pressed too hard, when I would wake from dreams of my father's hand slamming down, of my mother's voice, hissing, "You don't belong here," of Vanessa's smirk on the church steps. Some mornings I stared at myself in the mirror and half expected to see the girl who once hid in libraries clutching books like shields. But slowly, with every class, every page of case law, every kind word from professors and classmates, I began to replace those images. They did not disappear, but they lost their sharpness, their power to wound. One of the greatest gifts was connection. I started a small blog late one night, typing furiously at my desk after reading a court opinion on domestic violence. I wrote not about cases, but about survival, about what it meant to grow up unseen in your own home. I wrote about fear, about silence, about finding voice. At first, I thought no one would read it, but within weeks, messages trickled in: students, mothers, even retired veterans who said my words put language to pain they had buried. "You gave me courage." One message read, "I had never imagined I could be that for someone." Each response stitched something inside me back together. Mrs. Harper, my old mentor from Charleston, sent me a letter in her careful handwriting. "Justice is no longer an idea for you, Clara. You live it." I pinned those words to the wall above my desk where I could see them every morning before class. Judge Wallace called once a month, always beginning with the same phrase, "How's my star doing?" His belief in me had not wavered, and it reminded me that family could be chosen, that mentors could become anchors stronger than blood. As for my parents and Vanessa, contact dwindled into almost nothing. My father never wrote, though I heard through Wallace that the investigation into his debts had led to quiet settlements. My mother sent a single card at Christmas signed only with her name, the words, "May God keep you safe," written in careful cursive. Vanessa did not reach out at all. I expected to feel anger about the silence, but what I felt was relief. Distance had become a boundary, and boundaries were healing. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my apartment balcony watching fireworks explode over Durham. The air was cold, the colors bright, and for once I did not feel like a spectator at someone else's celebration. I lifted a mug of tea in my gloved hands and whispered to myself, "This is my life now." The scars of the past had not vanished, but they had become part of the map that led me here. I was not defined by their cruelty or their control. I was defined by survival by choice, by the courage to step into the light when they tried to bury me in shadows. Healing, I realized, was not about pretending it never happened. It was about building a future where their voices no longer dictated my worth. In the quiet of that night, beneath the crackle of fireworks and the hum of a new year beginning, I promised myself that I would keep speaking, keep fighting, keep standing tall. Not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. Because we do. And I finally knew it. When I look back now, the moments that once defined me, the sting of my father's slap, the echo of my mother's dismissive voice, the sight of Vanessa standing radiant while I was shoved into the shadows, no longer carry the same weight. They are still there, carved into the story of who I am, but they are no longer anchors dragging me under. Instead, they have become markers along a path I had to walk, milestones in a journey that taught me lessons far deeper than any classroom could. The truth is, family can wound in ways no stranger ever could. A stranger's insult can sting, but a parent's dismissal cuts into bone. A sibling's mockery can leave bruises unseen but deeply felt. For years, I believed those wounds meant I was defective, unworthy, destined always to be less than. But what I see now is that those wounds were never a reflection of my worth. They were a reflection of theirs, their blindness, their fears, their need to control. In Charleston, I grew up thinking love had to be earned, that obedience was the price of belonging, that silence was survival. But silence was a cage. It took standing on the steps of that church barred from my own sister's wedding to realize that silence was not safety. Speaking, acting, claiming my truth, that was the only real safety I would ever know. The irony is that the very tools they mocked me for, the books I clutched in libraries, the long nights of study, the so-called desk job in the shadow of the courthouse, became the tools that set me free. My father believed power was in his fists. My mother believed power was in appearances. Vanessa believed power was in charm and beauty. But real power was knowledge. Real power was strategy. Real power was refusing to let their version of the story be the only one told. For so long, I longed for their approval. I begged silently in every report card, every award, every tiny achievement. I thought if I just became enough, they would see me. But the harshest truth I learned is that some people will never see you no matter what you do. And their blindness is not your burden. It is not your job to shine so brightly that they finally open their eyes. It is your job to live, to thrive, to carry your own light forward regardless. I once believed blood was unbreakable, that loyalty to family meant enduring whatever came. Now I know loyalty without respect is just bondage. Respect is the foundation, and without it, no family can stand. That was why in that private room after the ceremony, I told them my final terms. If we are to have a relationship, it begins with respect. No more silence, no more erasure, no more pretending. And to my surprise, in the months that followed, some of that respect began to form not out of sudden affection, but out of the undeniable force of truth. My medal in their display case was more than decoration. It was an admission, however reluctant, that I had always belonged, even when they tried to cast me out. It was proof that truth eventually cracks even the hardest stone. But this is not just about me. My story is one among thousands, maybe millions. Families everywhere hold children hostage to impossible standards, erase the ones who do not fit their mold, punish those who dare to be different. Some of those children grow old still waiting for the love they never received. If my journey has taught me anything, it is that waiting is a trap. You cannot wait for them to validate you. You cannot wait for them to set you free. You must take the keys into your own hands. For anyone listening, for anyone who feels the sting of not belonging, I say this: your worth is not measured by your family's praise or their silence. It is measured by the life you build, by the courage you summon when no one is cheering, by the truth you carry, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Belonging does not come from their approval. Belonging comes from claiming your place in the world with or without it. The night Judge Wallace called me to the front row, calling me Your Honor, something shifted in me forever. It was not just a title. It was not just recognition. It was a symbol that the world I had built for myself, brick by brick, in silence and in shadows, was real and worthy. And the irony was delicious. The very family who had dismissed me had to sit and watch as the truth they denied was spoken aloud by someone with authority beyond their reach. Still, revenge was not the sweetest part. What truly healed me was not their shock, not their downfall, but the quiet peace I found afterward. Revenge may spark a fire, but peace is the lasting warmth. Peace was standing in my own apartment, studying by lamplight, knowing no one could take it from me. Peace was hearing from strangers who said my story gave them strength. Peace was knowing that the girl they said did not belong had built a place no one could take away. And so, the moral is this: your value is not determined by those who fail to see it. Their blindness is theirs to bear. Your task is to survive, to stand, to thrive, to live so fully that their silence becomes irrelevant. The day may come, as it did for me, when the world recognizes what they ignored, or it may not. Either way, you are enough. You always were. If you take nothing else from my story, let it be this: do not measure your worth in the eyes of those who refuse to look at you. Look inward, look forward, and know that you belong whether they say it or not. As I close this chapter of my story, I sit by the window of my small apartment, the lamp casting a warm glow on my journal. Outside, the world hums with its usual noise-traffic laughter, the faint chime of a clock tower. Inside, there is quiet. Not the suffocating quiet of fear, but the steady quiet of peace. For the first time in years, I no longer feel like an outsider looking in. I am no longer waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I have chosen it for myself, and that choice has changed everything. If you have followed me through this journey, the humiliation on the church steps, the cold rejection of my own family, the moment of truth when a judge called me Your Honor, and the ripple of consequences that followed, I hope you carry this with you. No one else defines where you belong. Not your parents, not your siblings, not the voices that tried to drown you out. Belonging is something you claim, not something you beg for. I know many of you watching have lived through versions of what I endured. Some of you carry scars from words spoken decades ago. Some of you still hear echoes of cruelty in your heads when the night is too quiet. And maybe, like me, you've wondered if you would ever be enough. I want to tell you right here, right now, you already are. When I stood in that church, every eye on me, every whisper slicing through the air, I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. I had truth at my side. I had courage even when my knees shook, and I had a voice, one they could no longer silence. You have those things too. Even if you don't feel them today, they are there waiting. So let me ask you, have you ever been told you didn't belong? Have you ever had someone you love dismiss your worth, erase your achievements, or silence your voice? I want to hear your story. Share it below in the comments. This space is not just about my journey, it is about all of ours. Every story matters, and sometimes the simple act of telling it is the first step toward freedom. If this story struck a chord, if you saw pieces of yourself in my words, don't carry that weight in silence. Speak it, write it, share it. And if you want to walk with others who believe in truth, justice, and the strength to rise above toxic ties, subscribe to this channel. Every week there will be a story waiting for you, one that might feel like it was written just for you. Because here, your experience is honored, your voice is valued, and no matter what anyone has told you before, you belong.